Hey, you. With a rhinestone dog collar. Between us dogs, I just convinced my human to upgrade to a new home with a 1,200 square foot bathroom. I think she called it a yard. With Wells Fargo's 3% down mortgage option, my human realized a new home was within reach. And I only gave her puppy eyes once. Get your human to talk to a mortgage consultant or learn more at wellsfargo.com/woof.
Wells Fargo Home Mortgage. Down payments as low as 3% on a fixed rate loan require mortgage insurance. Ask a home mortgage consultant about loan requirements. Wells Fargo Home Mortgage is a division of Wells Fargo Bank N.A., equal housing lender, NMLSR ID 399801.
It's the Autosport Podcast. We look back at the career of Jim Clark and ask where he stands among the greats. The 50th anniversary of the loss of Jim Clark, one of the all-time greats of motor racing, has been one of the big talking points of 2018. There's been all sorts of events and celebrations of his remarkable career, and we haven't really talked about Jim Clark a great deal on the Autosport Podcast, so we thought it would be a good chance just to have a bit of a look at his strengths as a driver, maybe challenge some of the assumptions and the things that are often said, and just get a bit of a deeper understanding of this phenomenal racing driver. I think no matter what your stance is on Jim Clark, he's one of the all-time greats. It's just that argument about whether he's in the top one or number 5 or whatever. We're not going to rank exactly, but we just want to get into the things that made him great. I'm your host, Ed Straw, and joining me to delve into Jim Clark first is Autosport magazine editor Kevin Turner. Now, Kev, you said a few minutes ago when we were talking about the magnum opus you created on Jim Clark's greatest drives and all the work you put into it. I think you said you'd never put as much effort into an article, into a feature as you did with that. So you are the world's leading authority on the greatest races of Jim Clark.
I'm not sure that I'd go quite that far. That was the target. So I read books, watched videos, and spent a lot of time in the archive going over the races, and actually looked at quite a lot of stats, because I think for some of the race reports at the time, they didn't have the access or immediate access to a lot of the stats that we have now. Say on Forex, there's a lot of statistics for some of the races that were really useful. So probably spent more time on that one piece, which ran in April. Because I felt a sort of an obligation to try and look at everything possible. So sports cars, F1, Tasman, even the touring car races in the Cortina, and read his own book. He did a book in 1964, which is interesting. And then there was a book on the release of his death as well, where quite a few of his friends had contributed, and that was really useful as well. So yeah, certainly spent a long time on it.
I believe that book's from my particular motorsport library, is it not?
Oh yes, I've not returned that one. Yeah. Which one's yours? Yours is the later one, isn't it? I think?
Yes, yeah. Because it's got each chapter's by a different significant player. There's people
and the other one is from the Autosport Outpost known as my dad's house.
There we go. And of course our bottomless pit that is the archive with all sorts of magazines and reports from the time.
Very easy to get distracted.
Yeah, exactly. There's all sorts in there. My other guest is Damien Smith. Now, Damien, you've spent a chunk of your career looking backwards, shall we say, at history. When it comes to somebody like Jim Clark, none of us ever saw him race. We're restricted to reading about him, to talking to his contemporaries, to watching what little footage there is, to just try and build up the picture of this driver and his strengths and weaknesses. So how do you approach something like that? How do you understand a driver who's so far disconnected from the world that we inhabit?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, I was born in the 70s, and like Kev, had a father who was immersed in motor racing, so I kind of grew up with the sport, and you find out through conversations about the past. You then start reading about it and looking into all the great books that exist and all the magazines, looking back through past issues, and also getting to know someone like Nigel Roebuck, who I've been lucky enough to know for 20 odd years and work closely with, and had so many conversations over a glass of wine with him about the people he knew, the people he's seen. You know, he didn't know Clark as a journalist. He knew Clark as a fan in the 60s, and he watched Clark race from that perspective as well. But I think what impresses me about Jim Clark, it's the aura that he had as a personality and as a racing driver. Everyone who knew him and everyone who witnessed him talk about this, that the fact that a race circuit, if Clark was on the entry list, there was a buzz, there was something special about the fact that he was there, and out on the track, everyone who raced against him felt it as well. And it was more than just about ability. It was about something about his character, this very modest guy who was a farmer from Scotland, and used to wear a cardigan to race. In those, you see those great Formula 1 pictures of him wearing a cardigan. Not a flamboyant man in any sense of the word, but he had something that is hard to define. And we'll get into this as further as we go in the conversation. But the era he was in, most people seem to think he was head and shoulders above those around him.
Yeah, that seems to be the common perception, and justifiably so, because I always think of it in terms of if you're looking at Formula One greats, kind of you go from one to another, and he kind of bridges the gap between Stirling Moss and Jackie Stewart. I think there's no doubt whatsoever that he was the preeminent Grand Prix driver of that era.
There was something about the pictures of him, the photographs of him as well. He was a very, this modesty didn't stop him being extremely cool. With that great sort of dark blue helmet with the white peak, and there's some fantastic portraits of him. I'm thinking particularly Jesse Alexander's portraits of him as well. This depth in his eyes, he had a real intensity about him. So there's a certain charisma, I guess, that comes about from, and also how he looked in the car with that straight armed approach he had, that style, which looks actually quite uncomfortable in a way, but obviously worked for him. And the way that photographers in those days could get onto the apex of a corner, people like Michael T would be standing where Clark was cornering, and you could see his face, and he particularly when he wasn't wearing a face mask, you could see the expressions on his face. He always seemed to have quite an expressive face in a racing car compared to some of the other guys he raced against. He was always seemed to be pulling faces. Just these little details about him. I was mesmerised by him as a child, growing up, through photographs and through what I read about him. And everyone I've spoken to since, as I've got involved in the sport, just talks about him with this on this other level.
Well, that kind of aura and that almost unknowability gets preserved, doesn't it? Because, for example, if you look at some of his contemporaries, we've all had the chance, for example, to spend time with someone like Jackie Stewart and get an understanding of the great depth of insight of motorsport. So, kind of to all of us, Jackie Stewart is, he's a great racing driver and a legend, but he is a tangible, real person, isn't he? Whereas Jim Clark, for none of us, can ever be that. And it also seems at the time, if you look at what people said, I interviewed Cedric Seltzer, who was his mechanic for his first championship year, and he said that it was difficult to kind of get to know Jim Clark. He was quite an intense kind of character with his own circle of friends, and you kind of worked with him. He was difficult to work with, but he was just somebody who didn't sort of put himself out there in a extrovert kind of way. So even for contemporaries, there was a bit of mystery there.
But I definitely think that the passage of time sort of helps the mystique, doesn't it? So you look at Clark, Gilles Villeneuve, and Senna. I think that their stature's probably increased over the time since they were killed. Whereas, you can still see an interview with, as you say, Jackie Stewart or Alain Prost or something. It doesn't sort of add to the sort of mystique in quite the same way. So although I can totally see that's why fans warm to these particular drivers. I think when you're trying to assess what they did, that's why I try and detach myself slightly from that and say, well, what did they actually do? Because it's very easy for these myths to sort of grow up and never get challenged. We'll get to one or two of those later on.
Well, you can also project what you want onto them as well, because
that's the Kimi Räikkönen factor.
If Jim Clark was still around and occasionally turning up and saying, because every now and again you'd have Jim Clark says this, and people think, oh, what an idiot, he said something stupid. But they never have the chance to kind of tarnish that legacy with reality. Nobody is a legend, is perfect. Everyone's human beings with their foibles, and they're right about some things, wrong about others. But when you kind of get cut off in that tragic way that Jim Clark was, it's like everything's sort of frozen, isn't it? And all the good kind of lives on, but nothing else is remembered. So he is almost a two-dimensional figure because of that. And this legend.
Yeah. We never saw him with sideburns and long hair. We didn't see him on slick tyres and wings, only briefly on, I guess just before he died, but not proper wings. The full 70s spec F1. He's frozen in time, and there is a certain mystique that creates, certainly. But I do think my fascination with him is based on what people say about him and the people who witnessed him and knew him, and the imagery is a big part of it, definitely. But I think there was something special about him as a racing driver.
Oh yeah, I'm not for one moment suggesting that there isn't. I mean, in fact, if Ed spoke to Seltzer and I've read his book, and also we had the good fortune to talk to Jackie Stewart about these things as well, and he always talks about Clark being the greatest. So yeah, he's absolutely up there in the top 5, top 10. Some people have him number 1, head and shoulders above everyone else, and that's perhaps where I start to part company with them. But yeah, no, he's absolutely he's in the top echelon, isn't he?
No, very much so. No doubt about that. Well, let's have a little bit of a look into Jim Clark and his strengths and what he had as a driver. The obvious place to start is the speed. Now, that's the prerequisite of any great racing driver. You've at least got to be very fast and ideally super fast. Kev, when you look at what Jim Clark did, was he unquestionably the fastest driver of that era, certainly between Moss and Jackie Stewart?
Yeah, I think you have to say so. I think that my issue sometimes comes with the head and shoulders thing. For example, in '67 with the Lotus 49, which is, I reckon, we worked out to be the 10th most dominant Formula One car of all time. Obviously, he was going to be way ahead, and the only person that was potentially going to be ahead, up there with him would be Graham Hill. Obviously, at that time, a one-time world champion. And Graham did better against Clark than is remembered, but he had incredible unreliability. But even if you take that out of it, Clark had 6 poles, Hill had 3. I think you'd have to say that Jimmy was the quickest. He had more poles than wins. Where it is a bit difficult is it's very difficult to decide how much of that is Jimmy and how much of it's the Lotus during the 60s, because apart from Graham, he didn't really have a top level teammate. The 1964 Rand Grand Prix, where Clark had injured himself with extracurricular activity prior to the race, Colin Chapman asked a then rising Formula 3 star to jump into the Lotus 33, who then put it on pole and won from the back in the second heat. Now, that rising star was Jackie Stewart, but that's effectively like saying that a Lance Stroll jumps into Lewis Hamilton's car and it goes quickest. So I think that you have to say he did have a car advantage more often than not, which must have played a part in that. But I think he was also able to be quick while looking after the machinery, which was absolutely essential with Colin Chapman Lotuses of the period.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Clark, there's lots of what-ifs, as there always is with these great drivers, but particularly the fact that, Sterling was cut down still in his prime, Easter Monday, 62, and when Jimmy was just starting to get into his stride. We missed out on something so special there, Moss. But then Moss would have been in an uncompetitive Ferrari versus a Lotus 25 that was getting better and better. So the likelihood is Jimmy would have beaten Sterling because the machinery was better. But
in 62, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened after that. But I think there's that famous line, isn't there, about Sterling saying, I'm going to have parity of equipment effectively, because he'd seen Clark. One of the races on the list that I did was the 61 South African Grand Prix, where Clark actually spun, giving Moss the lead, and he caught and passed him. And in his book, Clark's very sort of magnanimous about it and said, well, I did have a more modern car, but I think it's events like that made Moss think, I probably can't keep rocking up with inferior equipment. Yeah. And I think this is much more difficult to prove, but there has been suggestions that one of the reasons for that is that those were the 2 first drivers to cotton onto rotating the car under braking. Clark sort of talks about it a little bit at times in his book. Not in the way that we would talk about it now, and all the top drivers do it now, but it was something that wasn't really developed until the mid-engined Formula 1 cars came along. Moss twigged it probably quickest, and Clark was next along. JYS realised it after driving the Lotus, and I think that's probably not a coincidence that they were the top 3 drivers during that era. Yeah. So he was, but we were robbed either end.
Yeah, because the Stewart battle never quite happen.
No, because, well, funnily enough, not in Formula One. So, as part of